Great. Thanks very much, Melanie, and thanks to all of you for sticking around for the very last talk of the day. I will try and reward you by showing you some cool videos of robots. So hopefully this last session can be a little bit informal, and we can have a discussion about the relationship between morphology and language grounding. I loved today's sessions, thanks to the speakers and for those that asked great questions. I apologize, I had some teaching responsibilities today, so I was kind of jumping in and out of the session, but what I was able to hear I found really interesting, and looking forward to tomorrow's session as well. So just to sort of give you a teaser about what I wanted to share with you today is one of the things that my group works on is embodiment, but also specifically the role of the body. So here 4 cartoon robots to show that in most of the work we do not presuppose that the morphology or the embodiment of the robot is fixed. The moment you assume that you or a training algorithm can modify the body plan of the robot, that opens lots of interesting research questions. And I thought I would talk about the ones today related to language. So as I mentioned, we got a lot of things going on in my lab, but they all have this central theme of embodiment. We've heard that many times today. Embodiment means lots of different things to different people. So please take my conception of embodiment with a grain of sand. Alison was just talking about free will and mental simulation. This is something we've worked on in autonomous robots in years past. We also look at robots that suffer unanticipated changes to the body, like physical damage and injury. How do they adapt from that? Most recently, we've shown how you can actually automatically design the bodies of biological robots, otherwise known as the xenobots. I'm not going to talk about those projects today, but again, focus on this connection with language. If you're interested in some of these other projects, I'm obviously more than happy to chat offline about those as well. Okay, so I'm going to start approaching, I am not a linguist, I am an outsider when it comes to language, but as a roboticist, as was mentioned by Felix, I think this morning, we would obviously like to interact with our robots using natural language. There's an old story in robotics of the researcher that told the robot to open and then go through the door. And the robot complied perfectly, which of course is a perfectly fine understanding of this sentence. And again, as mentioned a few times today, this issue about surprise. So in retrospect, when we observe, a neural network's perverse behavior, or especially a robot's perverse instantiation of natural language, we might get a laugh out of it, but obviously if this were an autonomous car or a drone, it might not be a laughing matter. So in my group, we're coming at language from the issue of perverse instantiation. How do you get a robot to fulfill or instantiate the behavior implied in the language in the way that you would have wanted the robot to do so in retrospect, which is anyone who's worked in AI and robotics knows this is a very tricky thing to do. Okay, so again, we're coming at this attempt to try and tame perverse instantiation from an embodied point of view. This is probably old hat to most people on the call here, but it's been known for quite a while that there is some deep connection between language and the body and behavior. If you haven't seen the Pulvo-Muller work before, they put people in a brain scanner. And if they mention words like talk and lick, the face-related part of the motor strip would light up. If they heard arm-related words, grasp and pick, which sound similar to talk and lick, the arm part of the motor strip lights up, and so on. So there is known that there is this connection between body and language, but teasing that apart clearly is very difficult, especially when you're dealing with human subjects. So in our case, we use robots to try and forge a link between the body and language, and then analyze that link after the fact. So I'm going to start with robots here, and some of the work I'm going to show you over the next few minutes is some work carried out by an undergraduate working in my lab, David Matthews, a very gifted student. So all of the brilliant insight into the connection between the body and language that you see here is all David's. My inability to articulate his ideas is all my fault. Okay. You're probably familiar with Bratenberg vehicles, 2 photosensors on the front, 2 wheels on the back. If you shine a light front right on the Bratenberg vehicle, it will turn towards the left. This is about as simple a robot as you can imagine. But I wanted to touch on the Bratenberg vehicles to again nail down exactly what we mean about embodiment. This robot has a body. The moment it senses something and acts, its actions induce a change in its sensory stimulation. If you alter the physical structure of the robot, the exact same sensory stimulation, or the exact same motor can cause a different future sensor state. So the robot, in a sense, has the ability to influence its future sensor state based on the way that it moves. And this ability to alter the body gives us an opportunity to ground language in interesting ways. Okay. So if we want a robot to understand natural language, one approach is not to start from scratch, but to leverage the already amazing work that's going on with word embeddings. In this case, we used a now out-of-date word embedding, the notorious word-to-vec embedding system. For our purposes, bias and these other things are not important for the moment. So we're using a relatively simple word embedding, and we're going to expose our robots to these word embeddings in the following way. As most of you know, in every word embedding, you're associating an embedding or a vector with each word. And if you do this in an appropriate way, the embedding captures something about the semantic relationships between these words. So if we imagine we reduce this embedding to 2 dimensions, and we just have a 2-element long vector. If you take 2 words that most humans would agree are somewhat similar to one another, walk and run, the cosine similarity tends to be relatively high. If you take 2 words that most humans would agree as relatively semantically distinct, you get a much lower cosine similarity. Let's imagine that we take the 3 vectors associated with these 3 words, and again, they're not 2-dimensional, they're 200-dimensional. And we feed these embeddings into the input layer of the control policy of a robot. We have a very simple robot body. We're going to assume for the moment a very, very simple robot control policy. We have the input layer here, hidden layer here, motor layer here. We're going to assume we have a single input neuron, the auditory neuron. So we've stuck an ear on our robot, and we're going to feed the vector associated with walk into the input layer, which will prime or set the hidden layer or the internal state of the neural network. And then once the robot has heard the word walk, we let it go, it starts to move, and as it moves and interacts with its environment, receives sensory stimulation at other neurons in its input layer, it does something. Let's say we take exactly the same robot with exactly the same neural network, wipe the hidden layer clean, take the word embedding associated with run, push that through the auditory neuron, let go, let the robot do its thing, do the same thing a 3rd time. And that gives us 3 trajectories. If we plot the behavior of the robot after it's heard each of these 3 words in its sensory space, you also get 3 vectors. You can probably imagine where this is going. We can ask the question, what is the structure of this vector space compared to this vector space? If you take this robot and you take a random neural network and push through these 3 word vectors, what do you think the chance is that this simple Bratenberg vehicle is going to walk and run and halt? I know it's been a long day. Try and make this a little interactive. Probability is pretty low that this robot is obviously going to walk and run and halt, for a blindingly obvious reason, is that it cannot walk and it cannot run. It does not have the appropriate body plan to even do that. However, if you're feeling in a good mood, if the robot moves at low velocity for walk and higher velocity for run and doesn't move at all, stays relatively stationary for halt, you might say the robot's on its way to grounding these words. Again, it can't literally walk and run, so you might be motivated to add some physical complexity to this robot. You're going to bolt on some legs, If you expose it also to the word of grasp or pick up or carry, maybe you give it some arms or a gripper. But the moment you start to add mechanical complexity to the robot, the probability that it's going to align its sensory structure with the semantic structure in the word embedding goes down, and I'll talk about why in a moment. Assuming we can train this robot to move slowly when it hears the embedding for walk, move quickly when it hears the embedding for run, and move not at all when it hears the embedding for halt. If you have 3 objective functions or 3 loss functions that appropriately select for those behaviors, when the robot receives that word embedding, you might be able to induce this sensory structure, which again in this cartoon example is not bad. If you do manage to induce this alignment, you can ask the following question, which again has been mentioned several times today, which is, can the robot generalize to language it's never heard before? If you take the word embedding for stop, which in the semantic space of word to vec has high cosine similarity, what's the likelihood if you take a trained robot and feed it the embedding for stop, that it will stop, that it will obey a command that it's never heard before in the way that a human in retrospect would assume that it would, which in this simple case would be that it doesn't move. Turns out that in simple cases, you can get this to work, and this is some results from David's paper. In the first place, I'm going to show you an evolved robot. We used a simple evolutionary algorithm here to train the neural network controller for this robot. We fed in the embedding for the word backward, and this robot was trained for against an objective function that selects for moving in the negative x direction. Not surprisingly, with that embedding, it actually does move in the negative x direction. That same evolved neural network was fed the word, sorry, I think I missed one here. Same evolved neural network, we fed in the word for forward and trained it against the objective plus x to maximize the x direction. Same evolved neural network obeys that command. If you train it against the word stop and the objective function penalizes for movement, it stays where it is. So we're basically evaluating every neural network 3 times. We feed it those 3 embeddings and we apply those 3 objective functions, and we evolve this single neural network that obeys all 3 objective functions. After it's been primed with those 3 embeddings, we then, after training, fed it the word halt, which it had never heard before. And again, you can imagine where this is going. It actually stays still. Perhaps not so surprising, given the fact that this robot has a relatively simple body plan. But let me show you that it's maybe not as simple as you might imagine. In this full experiment, we evaluated every neural network against a total of 6 word embeddings, a misspelled version of forward, forward, backward, backwards, stop, and suspend. So we evaluated every neural network a total of 6 times. We did this multiple independent times, and at the end, we got back a whole bunch of evolved neural networks that induced the robot to move when it heard forward, backward, and backwards. It moved about 4, 5, or 6 body lengths in the right direction, either forward or backward. The same set of trained neural networks, when they were fed stop or suspend, stayed relatively stationary. They moved very little. When we took a 7th held out synonym that had never heard before, cease, most of the time the trained robots would not move. We then took these 7 word embeddings and we permuted the elements in the vectors associated with those 7 words. So that it was basically the same vectors, just permuted. We again trained the robot on these 6 permuted word vectors, and the robot successfully learned to move when it was supposed to move, stay still when it was supposed to stay still. But when we exposed it to the 7th permuted word embedding, it did not obey. It did not do what it was supposed to be doing. So that demonstrates that in order to get this process to work, in order to train a robot to obey words it's never heard before, we need to lean on word embeddings and have in hand objective functions for all the training words. Again, it's a tall order, but it can be done. One of the interesting things we found is if you do this with this relatively simple quadruped, it works pretty well. David also made this very simple ball bot. Inside this ball bot is a spinning flywheel, and the motor can control the velocity of the flywheel. So this wheel bot can move in arbitrary directions. Turns out if you do exactly the same experiment with this robot morphology, it does not achieve this ability. So you'll notice there's relatively little difference between the orange and blue bars here. So it's, there's a little bit more difference here between the orange and blue bars. It's not staying still when it's hearing an unheard word for stay still. And there's not much difference between the two blue bars here, meaning there's not much of a difference in the robot's ability to obey when you permute the word embeddings. Meaning that this robot is evolving the ability to obey somewhat, but it's kind of ignoring the semantic structure that is latent in the word embeddings. So if you have one robot for which you can combine objective functions and word embeddings to get them to obey previously unheard words, and you have another robot that doesn't, that suggests there may be a gradient in morphospace, which is the space of all possible robot morphologies. So I want you now to imagine an evolutionary algorithm that is moving through the space of all possible robot morphologies, and the fitness of any one robot morphology or body plan is its ability to exhibit this behavior. So imagine we have an outer loop, which is evolving the body of the robot, and the inner loop is training these control policies given the word embeddings and the robot's own sensory stimulation. So the next part of the talk I want to show you is another experiment where now we're going to actually see if we can find robot body plans that are increasingly good at grounding language. And we did this, again, this was a project with David Matthews. We did this by crowdsourcing the evolution of robots. So this is a project called Twitch Plays Robotics. You can Google it, and as of an hour ago, it was still up and running. You can go and try it for yourself. But I thought since it's Friday afternoon here, we try an interactive version of this. So I'm going to press play on this video, and as you can see, you're going to see pairs of robots. Each robot has a name. In this case, we have robot BC and robot JO, the blue cyan robot and the jade orange robot. Both of these robots, when I unpause this video, have been fed the embedding associated with moving. And what we asked the crowd, and what we're still asking the crowd, is to type in for a series of robot pairs, which is better at, in this case, moving. So I don't know if I can see the chat, so I'll have to trust you here. Type into chat when I unpause it whether BC or JO is better at moving. This is going to go pretty quickly. You'll see another pair and then another pair, so just go ahead and type into chat your preference. Okay, I actually managed to see chat here, so I can see pretty unanimous on JC at the end there. So we've been running this for about 3 years. We have a fascinating data set which has something to do with language grounding, but there's also some fascinating social dynamics in the raw chat that we've pulled off this website. Anyone interested in humans and social dynamics, please come see me. We would love to mine this data to see what's going on with the humans. One of the many, many interesting behaviors we saw among the humans is that they were often unsure themselves of what moving means. You might have noticed in this last one here, both robots were moving, but in very different ways. So we got a lot of spontaneous chat where the users are asking each other, what do you mean by move? What do you mean by move? If the command is jump, what does jump actually mean? What does forward mean? What does walk mean? I think the humans learned much more than the robots did in this experiment, which is they learned that they didn't actually have a firm grasp themselves on what actually the meaning of a word means. They might feel confident in what it means for a human, but what it means for an autonomous agent with arbitrary morphology, much more difficult. Okay. You can probably imagine what we did with the actual chat with the preferences. This becomes a reinforcement learning problem where we basically sum up the positive and negative reinforcement for each robot, and more positive reinforcement and less negative reinforcement for a robot means it survives. Another robot that gets lots of negative reinforcement and little positive reinforcement is deleted. The surviving robots produce randomly modified copies of themselves, where they have slightly different body plans and slightly different control policies. And I'll show you a little bit of what we got in terms of data. Here is one phylogeny that evolved, and this genetically related population of robots survived on the website for about a week and a half. You'll notice they all have pretty distinct morphologies, starting from the ancestor up here. We then took this particular lineage, and we took all of the different commands that the crowd issued to the robot. So I forgot to mention as well, on this website you can indicate your preference for one of the two robots. You can also type in new words that you'd like to try and teach the robots. People typed in lots of short motoric commands: jump, turn left, stay still, look at the camera. That one was kind of motoric. Someone else commanded the robot to be yourself. That was kind of an interesting one. Someone else asked the robots to prove Fermat's last theorem. Maybe not so groundable in their simple morphologies. We got almost 700 unique commands. We took each pair of commands and we took the word embeddings associated with those two commands and computed the cosine similarity, or sorry, the cosine difference between that pair of embeddings, which gave us the semantic distance according to word to vec. So generally speaking, if we took a pair of words out here, I think this pair of words out here was launch and crouch, which again, motorically, you could understand humans would consider to be quite different from one another. Word pairs of commands out here, where semantic distance was quite low. This was things like move, shuffle, move, moving, moves, and so on. For each of those command pairs, we looked at all the robots that received those pairs of commands and how they moved. And it's very difficult to obviously compare behavior. I won't go into that in the interest of time, but we could basically take a given pair of commands, ask how different those words were according to humans, and how differently they caused the robots to move. And we would like to see perfect correlation here. The more different those pair of words were to humans, the more differently we would like the robots to be moving, and vice versa. As you can see in this particular lineage, there was no correlation whatsoever. We looked at a second lineage that survived about 10 days on the website at a different point in time. These machines received many, many more commands, but again, there was no alignment between semantic structure and behavioral structure according to these robots. We looked at a third clade, a fourth, a fifth, in a sixth, and we controlled for the other 5 clades here, there actually is a significant alignment between words and the behavior of these robots. Now comes the tough part of the talk. What is it about these particular robot body plans that allow them to ground human language in their own behavior better than these 5 lineages? If anybody has any ideas, we would love to hear it, because we have absolutely no idea what is unique about these body plans. You might think that intuitively, robots that have a little bit more of an anthropomorphic body plan perhaps would be able to ground language better. And you can see some representative samples here. Obviously, they don't look like human beings, but there are things that stand up, that have pairs of arms and legs. They have bilateral symmetry. They have eyes, and so on. We haven't seen any relationship between anthropomorphic form and the ability to align semantic and behavioral, align semantics and behavior. Okay, I think I'll wrap up there. As I mentioned in the first project, we are basically just demonstrating that morphology matters. Your physical structure actually dictates your ability to ground language. And in the second project, I was showing you this crowdsourcing project where we're actually trying to recruit the crowd to search the space of robot body plans for those robots that are more easily able to ground language in the way we would expect them to ground them. So thanks to David and Sam and Colin for the bulk of work on this. Thanks very much, and if there's time, I'm happy to answer some questions.
Great, thank you, Josh. That was fascinating. Anybody have any questions?
It's been a long day. Everybody's ready for dinner.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Presumably you could do this the other way around, right?
How so?
You fix the body morphology, and then you try and generate language that is
yeah, okay.
compatible.
Yeah, actually we noticed, and again, this is anecdotal. We haven't looked at this in detail, but things that actually like had legs and showed oscillation when they were moving, the crowd would tend to issue words like walk or run. And when there were things that were kind of rolling or staying close to the ground and shuffling along, they would use words like move forward, move back. So it looks like the crowd is, again, spontaneously trying to scaffold the robots by choosing the appropriate language for the robot's body plan. So if that's what you mean, I think we might be able to go in the other direction. Is that what you meant?
It's sort of, yeah. Right, like if you were evolving a language or something.
Evolving a language, yeah. I mean, there's been some interesting work there as well.
People have done a lot of research on sort of the history of language or language evolution and so on. And I'm wondering if there's, to what extent our human languages are correlated in this way with our body morphologies.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned Lakoff, of course, and Rafael Nunez has also looked at this as well, where mathematics comes from. And as a dyed-in-the-wool embodied researcher, I'd say absolutely there are aspects of language that are rooted deeply in the body. And you can see that, again, coming out from the human crowd when they alter their language based on the bodies of the robots. But how to capture that and ground that well, still a lot of work to do there.
Okay.
Oh, sorry,
go ahead.
I raised my hand.
Oh, sorry.
It was, let other people go first.
Okay. Fatai Ravi Kumar Prasant. Sorry if I messed up your name.
No, you got it right. Thanks, Josh. It was a really fascinating talk.
Sure.
I've read the Breitenberg vehicles before, and I was wondering if you had a chance to look at more complex internal structures like the vehicle 2 and vehicle 3, where the cross-modal connections start happening between the sensors. The cross,
that's a great question. We so these robots definitely, we have multimodal sensors in here. So there's touch, pressure, the beams coming out of the eyeballs are just simple, proximity sensors. There's proprioceptive sensors. When we measured behavioral distance, so the same robot receives two different embeddings and moves in two different ways, and we were comparing the behavioral distance, we actually didn't use the sensors because we didn't want to build in our bias. So if the word was jump, then we might be biased to look at pressure because there's more pressure on the the bottom of the robot. If it's look at the camera, then maybe we'd focus on the proximity sensors. We actually used the crowd reinforcement to measure behavioral distance, and it's a bit of a calculation to do it. But basically, it was the raw chat that you all typed in that we can infer how different the robots are behaving. So if you take the same pair of robots, play them twice, one after the other, and they receive different commands, if the crowd disagrees, that means that the robots are doing something different. If they agree in both cases. So we intentionally did not look at whether sensor signals could predict or aligned directly with semantic structure. It's actually crowd reinforcement, inferring behavioral distance, seeing whether it aligns with semantic distance. But we have all the sensor data as well. It would be great to go back and dive in and see if such a relationship can be found.
Really fascinating.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for
sharing. Thanks for your question.
Okay, Kevin.
Thanks for the great talk. So in the commands that were given to the robots, they often felt kind of like macro actions, like run this way or like jump or something. But when I think about like what kind of directions I might give to a person, they might be more like goal directed, like go to the beacon or something like that.
Yep.
And I was wondering if if in the environment there was room for those kind of instructions, and if humans ever like propose those in the Twitch chat. And also, I guess that would kind of gum up the behavioral distance measure if you were to have it be goal-based, because go to the beacon over here would have very different behavior from like go to the beacon over there. So like how would you try to do the same kind of analysis for like goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had kind of a very simple environment there. We had one environment was the Indiana ball of doom, this big ball that would roll towards the robot. So you'd see people say, get out of the way, move left, move right. But I think, just an artifact of this experiment, the structure of the robot's body is richer than their environment, which is usually not the case in robotics. Usually it's the body is less complicated than the environment in which they're in, or in some non-embodied agent, in experiments, there is no body at all. And that was, again, sort of intentional on our part. So not surprisingly, I think the crowd focused more on the affordances latent in the body plans of the robots rather than what was out there in the environment. And like you said, it would also, it could also be a confounding factor, because for the exact same robot, if it didn't look at the ball, but the ball was in different positions, there's no way it would be able to distinguish between those. But it would be definitely something interesting to look at in future experiments.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Okay, Stephanie.
Hi guys, thanks. I really enjoyed this talk.
Yeah.
I was trying to think about why the final result of this evolutionary crowdsourcing wouldn't just be a body that's human-like. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that are. And then also I was wondering, I was thinking that like this experiment maybe ask kind of two questions at once, like what kind of body is good at locomotion, and also what kind of body is good for grounding. So I was wondering how you think we might disentangle those questions.
Yeah, great question. So why did the robots not converge on a human body plan? There may be several answers to that. One of them is we're using an evolutionary algorithm. So evolution may never have moved in morphospace anywhere near anything resembling a human body. So again, it might just be an artifact. If we redid this experiment again, we may see human body plans. But I think that the main reason why it did not is because, as we know from developmental psychology, parents don't teach children, children teach parents. So again, if you look at the raw chat among the humans, they're often talking amongst themselves about how best to train this set of robots or this set of robots. So there, for each of these 6 clades, and there are many, many more that were sort of dominant on the website at different times, the crowd was using different subsets of commands. So, you know, implicitly or unconsciously, the crowd was probably seeing different affordances, you know, what these particular robots are capable of, and most importantly, what they're not capable of. And based on what the crowd saw in those robots, they may have actually, when they then reinforced those commands against that clade, was relatively unsuccessful in these cases, but for some reason was successful in this case. Again, I have no idea why. So I think it's not that, I'm guessing, it's not that human trainers are implicitly pulling the evolving population of robots towards us, towards what we think of as move, jump, turn left, turn right, look at the camera. It's this give and take between the robots which are evolving and the human trainers which are getting better at guessing or predicting or implicitly knowing how to successfully reinforce these robots. Again, that's kind of a big claim. I'm not sure if that's actually what's going on, but it seems like that's what's going on. And I completely lost track of what the second part of your question was.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. That made a lot of sense and was really interesting. The second part of my question was kind of a hypothesis about why we didn't get something human-like, but I think it's a more general question too, about how this experiment kind of asked 2 questions at once, like what kind of bodies are good at locomoting, like, you know, have good balance and have, you know, these extra arms that can, you know, yeah, maybe do human-like things, as well as, yeah, this question about language grounding. And
right.
These may be 2 things that are kind of mixed together.
I think the first part of what you said, I think it's actually the opposite. I think the robots that were more successful here were the ones that were actually not very good at locomoting. They were good at only 1 or 2 things. And in this particular case, the crowd found out what those things were. So the robots weren't distracted, and the human trainers weren't distracted by trying to teach that group of robots 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 different, you know, basic motoric behaviors. Again, that's anecdotal. A robot that actually was capable and could do lots of different things depending on what it heard, I think then you would get into catastrophic interference and some of the other issues that AI tends to struggle with. I think it's the quote-unquote helpless robots that show the glimmer of ability on 1 or a few commands. That's what the crowd cottons onto, and that's where they're able to provide a clean enough reinforcement signal to evolve them to be a little bit better at those commands. Again, anecdotal. But thanks for your ideas, Stephanie. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we adjourn? Well, thank you so much, Josh. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the people who stayed for the last talk. This has been a great day. I'm really excited, and I will look forward